Great. So, um, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm looking forward to this time with you and to sharing with you. Uh, when the pastor reached out to me about teaching at this time of year, I was excited by the prospect to have not not just to teach generally about Judaism, though there is plenty I will convey that is a little more general, and I'll go into that kind of more broad or introductory terrain, but that we're coming right off of a large period, a long period of holidays. So I had something to help focus the teaching, and not only that, I will say a little not as quite as impressive on Zoom, but still that I will have some items that I'll get to later for show and tell. So that's always, we never tire of that. And I think show and tell is good for all ages. So I hope that I know that will be an enjoyable part of our time. Um, so I want to start with the um, uh, start with where we are in the Jewish year. Just as I mentioned, coming off of we've just had a whole series of holidays, our high holy days, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, Yom Kippur, known as the Day of Atonement, but what I want to start by speaking about is after those holidays that are really focused on an inward journey, um, on growth, on reflecting on how we've behaved in the past year and how we want to behave differently, the changes we want to make in the upcoming year, a journey that is very head-oriented, very almost, you could call it cerebral. We follow that up with the holiday of Sukkot, which I like to think of as a much more experiential, sensory kind of whole body. We move out of our heads and more into, as I said, into just feeling and lived experience. And we do that by the festival of Sukkot, or the festival of booths, is a holiday in which, for described in the Torah and the 5 books of Moses, in which we go out. We're commanded for 7 days to dwell in booths. There isn't a lot of detail about what that means, what that might be, or why. So a lot of the practice comes from the commentary, the law that comes after the Torah, of what is the nature of this holiday. So what we are meant to do is live in these temporary dwellings. Temporary in this, they cannot be fully enclosed, so they need to be open, both in order to enter permanently, so they're open to the elements not only from the walls, but the top must be see-through to some degree. It must, primarily when the sun is up, the inside of the booth must be in the shade. It must provide shade, but still we must be able to see the sky. So it's truly open to the elements, and we can ask, and in that tradition of what the Sukkah is, we can start to understand what the meaning is behind the holiday. The idea of being in these temporary in these temporary dwellings means that no matter who you are, no matter how luxurious or palatial your home may be, you must, for this period of time, go out and spend time in this dwelling, in this temporary dwelling. And by spend time, at a minimum, eating meals, the more traditionally observant, many of them will actually, basically it's their Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts moment, right? They're sleeping out they're fully dwelling in these booths. And it is during this time of the year also that we read the book Ecclesiastes. Most of our holidays, our major holidays, all have a book of the Bible that is read in addition to sections from the Torah and from the book of prophets that we read on that holiday. So on Sukkot, we read Ecclesiastes, which I think is also an indicator of what the meaning is. Some of the meanings are, I should say, not the meaning. There's meaning heaped upon meaning when it comes to all of our traditions, holidays, symbols. But in the case of Sukkot, I think that the primary kind of trajectory is this experience of the temporary, of the tenuousness of life. I always say, actually, I remember the first time reading Ecclesiastes, probably maybe in college or just post-college, it struck me as a wonderful work for teenage angst. I think it's the most existential work, or one of the most existential works in the Bible, really pointing out that life is full of cycles, that the just is not necessarily always rewarded, that people can chase after a great name and attain that, and leave behind other concerns and not necessarily be punished. And so how do we find meaning in life? I think that there is a happy ending kind of coda attached to it that I think, as I put, I think that was kind of attached in order to make it kosher, so that, so to speak, so that it could be accepted in the community, or maybe even would make it in as a canonical work, and not seeming to be completely undermining of the religious, project, or utterly skeptical. Job, right, does the same thing. I might point out there's this nice happy ending attached, but really in the thick of Ecclesiastes, in the meat of it, it's powerful. It's powerful stuff. It raises truly deep questions. And reading that while we're out in this temporary structure, exposed to the elements, reading about how to everything there's a season, right? And it's always, yes, there's consolation and comfort in that, but it also means there is the potential for dread as well. All of that, I think, is tremendously humbling in the best way. We wouldn't want to live there all year long, but it's also a very powerful experiential way to say we should not get too comfortable either. We should not get lost in the illusion of our, I'll say, particularly if we're living in a palatial mansion, that we're insulated from all of this. We're still human. Life is still fragile, and it not just the humility for our own sake, but really a humility geared towards, as it always is with Judaism, I think, how we treat others, both interpersonal, but even more cultivating a sense of taking care of those who are less fortunate. that we should not forget. Essentially, it's an experience of homelessness, right? More or less, this very exposed kind of dwelling really, it really forces us to face this. So I will add about the Sukkah that just to note that the reasoning behind it is manifold. We're told that it's a commemoration of the Israelites wandering through the desert. It's not all about the tenuousness and the so bleak. There are also connections, not scriptural, but in the Jewish commentary, which connected to God's protection during the desert. There's even a commentary, a kind of legendary commentary that creates a parallel or says that this idea we're meant to be able to see through the roof of the sukkah because it evokes these miraculous clouds of glory that hovered over the Israelites as they wandered through the desert. And here is just an opportunity. This morning, I think it's something that wasn't planned, but I think it was fortuitous and worth mentioning here as well. Just a side note about the commentary, the way the Jewish tradition, the commentary on Scripture. There are many sorts, but the earliest really would be, I think, familiar to many of you as kind of parables, or looking at. They don't make their point, right? They don't state it in an essay fashion. It's through storytelling, and of filling in the details that we're missing in a story to understand Scripture better. So, for example, what I told this morning was we have this question of where does Abraham suddenly, why does he become the first Jew, the first monotheist? And so to explain this, there's a legendary tale about Abraham as a child and his father as a seller of idols. And Abraham looks, and as a good sharp kid, looks at all these idols and thinks, where's the power here? They all fight with each other. This isn't what a god should be. There should be one ruling or reigning power. So while his father is out one day, he smashes all the idols except for one. And when his father comes back in and is furious and says, "What happened?" Abraham simply points at that one idol and said, "He did it. He's the most powerful." And in that way kind of both tries to teach his father a lesson, but also manages to do what he thinks is right by helping to move away from idolatry. So these kinds of tales come up and are created and are usually driven by by linguistic issues. So just to bring us back, how did we get to this tangent? There is a legendary material about why do we have this construct of the Sukkah. In our other holidays, there's much more a clearer connection to some event that happened in history. So there's in the Torah, in the 5 books. So this is the connection. The holiday of Sukkot, actually all really the 3 pilgrimage festivals in particular, and Sukkot was a pilgrimage festival, a time when Jews were expected to appear at least once a year. They were expected to appear in Jerusalem and to sacrifice at the temple. So they were connected to the agricultural cycle of the land of Israel. Most people were farmers at that point. So each of our holidays has numerous names that describe different aspects. For example, right, Chag Sukkot, the festival of booths. A Sukkot is a booth. Excuse me. It's also known as Zman Simchatenu, the time of our joy. It seemed to be there was a huge water libation festival that took place at this time that was basically the spring cleaning during the fall of the temple that took place on Sukkot. But it also was, we can see in it connections to the Greek culture that the Jewish people in the land of Israel were in relation with, in that it was a Dionysian festival. There was a tremendous amount of celebration with wine and partying. So it's a time of our joy, and Chag HaAsif, the festival of the harvest. So the Sukkah is also reminiscent of a legitimate material culture from not just from the ancient world, actually, as I was saying this morning, but we know in the ancient world, individuals' fields would not be right next to their home. So during the harvest time, they really would have to go and live in these booths. And I had the good fortune, and I lived in Israel for a few years and was on several programs. And on one of those programs, we went for a hike during this time of year. And they intentionally brought us to a field where an Israeli farmer had one of these booths set up to be near their fields. And I have to say that it is the shade that is cast and the way that the structure with the walls and ceiling being open capture the wind. It is literally natural air conditioning. Between the shade and the wind coming through in a hot Middle Eastern day, it is delightful, and you can see why they inspired, the desire to spend time in this kind of structure. And it's a good example of the interplay of what was already being done. And we talk about this in our own modern times, right? How do we've perhaps lost a little of the sense of ritual, or we talk about trying to sanctify the everyday. And this would have been of an ingenious way to do that, to take a practice that was being carried out as part of their everyday life in ancient world and give it a deeper significance and meaning. So it is at the end of the holiday of Sukkot that we start to pray for rain. All of our prayers, or the connections to the environment in Judaism, are all based on the calendar of the cycle of the natural world in the land of Israel. So even though we live here, anywhere we live in the world, we start praying for rain at the same time. Really, it's kind of we're directed towards the land of Israel, and I say all that because one of the next ritual, the show and tell piece, I think is really connected to this prayer for rain. What I didn't...
Rabbi, if I could jump in here just briefly before we get to the next portion, it's a little harder to do on Zoom, so I just want to jump in and ask if there are questions folks have up until
I was just about to do that, Pastor. We didn't do that this morning, but I felt I've been talking for a while. Let's see if there's...
Yeah, if there are questions, comments, concerns, insights, go ahead, take yourself off mute and jump in.
I have a quick question. In these booths, are these where do families go, or are these for individuals go?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I'm realizing there's so many details to fill in here. So ideally it's for each family, but we, in the modern era, And I think this would have been the case in ancient times as well. You also have communal ones in the modern period, especially among more liberal communities where people aren't as strictly observant. For instance, our synagogue, we put up a sukkah and invited people to come in. But the idea is that each family could or should have one, whatever provides. But the main focus is that you have the opportunity to sit and dine in a sukkah. And you give me the opportunity to touch on something I touched on in the morning, but didn't get to here, which is that another piece of this holiday in that respect is that there's a tremendous degree of hospitality. And in fact, this morning I connected with, at the same time as there's this existential feeling of what's keeping me, what's between me and my own mortality, right? A connection to the divine, certainly. And also in Judaism, we very much experience the divine through relation, so community. And so there is a real valuing of inviting in guests to dine with us. And there's a spiritual element as well. The word for it is ushpizin. It's an Aramaic word in origin, having to do with inviting guests. And we have legendary guests that even if we don't have someone with us, we imagine our greatest heroes, which traditionally were male figures in the Bible, the patriarchs, Moses, David, and in modern times we've also added biblical heroines, and in certain communities we also talk about our own personal heroes, our forebears who were role models. It's also about taking taking inspiration from human role models who are spiritually their guests in that sukkah and quite literally inhabit our lives and inspire us.
So it's not just a place for praying during this time. It's used for
No.
Okay.
No, and the prayers wouldn't necessarily. We would. It's actually more seen as a lived space, a place for meals, a place for sleeping. Not that you're not allowed to pray, but that's not the focus.
So if it is a raining week like it's been last week, can you pick a different week?
No. Our holidays, some of you may know this, some of you may have noticed this and not know what I'm about to say, which is that we function on our own calendar. The holidays all fall on, they correlate to certain dates on the Jewish calendar. And just an opportunity to say that the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar that is correlated to a solar calendar, which sounds very fancy, but can very easily be explained that whereas in Islam, you may know that Islam has its own calendar, but you may be familiar, I may be teaching you something here too, that Ramadan, for instance, will fall at every different season. It is strictly a lunar calendar. Judaism, because our holidays do correlate to specific seasons, and the meaning is that there's an embedded meaning in that connection, we want to stay within the right time of year, even as our months vary between 28, 29 days, sometimes 30 days long. So there's a very complicated formula. In fact, there's a medieval figure, religious figure, but also mathematician, kind of Renaissance man, who rose to ascendancy for his ability to calculate the Jewish calendar that helped guide the whole community. But I can tell you in 19 years, we have 7 leap years. I can't tell you when they fall. Again, it's a complicated mathematical figure. We Jews don't like things easy, apparently. And a leap year adds an entire month. So again, some of this you may or may not have heard, but give you some of the flavor of Judaism. We talk about are the holidays early or late this year? We also joke, nobody ever says, oh, they're right when they should be. But this year, Rosh Hashanah started on the night of Labor Day. That's incredibly early. We wanted to start it like sometime in the month of September, but then you get a leap year and it suddenly gets really late, and then it slowly moves back earlier, and then the leap year comes, and so.
And with many of the festivals being tied to a lunar calendar, I don't think it's coincidence that a lot of the festivals are related to when the full moon is. So we've
Yes.
got natural light to celebrate. You know, if the celebration starts in the evening, you've got that natural light, and it's a nice time to be outside celebrating in that part of the world.
Thank you. And actually just gives you an opportunity to share that I did a gap year in Israel between high school and college, where part of the year I lived on a kibbutz, an agricultural collective that had been founded by the youth group that I grew up in and went with. It was down in the desert, in the Negev, the southern desert of Israel. And to experience a full moon in that, maybe this is any desert, I'm trying to think, but in that part of the world, in that area in particular, it's a large plain. I'm thinking of a desert as opposed to, more hilly terrain. This is flat. It's the Great African Rift. So there are mountains on either side, and you're on this plain. I mean, the full moon could almost be a sun. It casts a shadow. I mean, it's dramatic, and there's no question that our holidays were primarily correlated with that middle of the month. So thank you, Pastor. Other questions? So I will, that being the case, I continue. I mention the rain because I think it's one of the crucial explanation for the ritual items that I will show you that are the other hallmarks of the holiday of Sukkot. This is a lulav, is what it's called. I was going to say what's called in Hebrew. This is one of those rare things. I don't think there is, I don't know of an English name for a lulav. Most of our ritual items, there's something, but, and I'll talk about what it's composed of, but you can see that it's vegetation, that it's from a tree. And this is the one sad thing that you're not able to smell this citron, which is incredibly sweet and fragrant. Even though, as people asked this morning, to eat it does not. There are ways to prepare it where it can be consumed, but not a terribly tasty fruit, but incredibly fragrant. And during this time of year, we take the lulav. So I'll just note, and I'll come back to it, which are palm fronds. And this was the other, I forgot to add, the other thing that drew me to talking about this, knowing that there's great significance to the palm to the palm leaves, the palm tree in Christian tradition. Also, I didn't note this morning, but from what I understand, that connection with the palm has to do with Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem on the festival of Sukkot. So that's part of the connection here. And Sukkot is a holiday associated with redemption, with salvation. So I think it would make that connection makes sense. So you have a palm frond, myrtle, and willow. And what we do is we take these and we put them together. And during a particular part of the prayer, recitation of Psalm 118, which is part of not just Sukkot, but all of our festival prayer, it is shaken. And actually, what I'll invite you to do, if you'd like, is to, I don't know how it'll, well, we'll give it a try on Zoom. If you want to try letting your eyes close while I shake this and just see what it conjures for you. If you'd like to open, I'm curious what people want to share. What again, I don't know how it sounded, if it translated, but what it evoked for you, or what it reminded you of, or what you heard.
Fire or a flag whipping, one of the two.
Fire or flag whipping. All right, I definitely could hear fire in particular.
It kind of almost reminded me we were talking about like atonement or whatnot, like just shaking evil away.
Uh-huh. Anyone else? So, as I mentioned, this is even as I talked about all these meanings, right? My intro was this is a time to get out of our heads. So I should note, coming around to this, right? Yes, there are all these meanings, but really you go out, you're in nature, right? You feel the elements, and the lulav and etrog, as I said, you can't smell. Actually, all of these have a smell when it's fresh. So there's smell and sound. You get the sound of the leaves. I like to say this is the Jewish rain stick. So fire, Tom struck me as pretty close to what we might, even though elementally it's not so similar to rain, but there is that, there's that similar kind of crackling, sizzling when, whether it's the wood being burned or when wood, trees, branches, leaves are hit by rain, by a hard rain wind, they make a very similar sound. And I do think that that's part of what it's meant to evoke. I was noting that these are symbols that have kind of experienced a resurgence religiously. In more liberal settings, they wouldn't have typically been used, but just to note on a very modern kind of anthropological level or sociological, that Judaism has seen in recent time a bit of a return to tradition, in the sense of ritual. 20th century, mid-century, earlier, Jews were new immigrants, were trying to lose their kind of old world mystery cult kind of feeling. And the pendulum swung so far that people felt we kind of lost a lot of, that mystery brings with it power, layers of meaning. And so I say all that because I'm going to I'll end with talking about this, at least with some of the more spiritual and kind of ethical elements. But just to note that as an ancient, several thousand-year-old ritual, it has those elements. Kim, you talked about, sort of shaking the evil away. There is a quote in the Talmud, very brief reference, noting that, talking about the lulav as a sword against demonic powers or evil powers. And it does look like a sword. So I think there's something to that. I segued from talking about a time that we start to pray for rain. I think it evokes the sound of rain. There's that visceral kind of experience. And in the ancient world, I refer to this as a kind of talisman, bringing these together. In the ancient world, there were traditions of bringing vegetation or shaking it as part of prayers for rain. You bring that thing that represents, I mean, the palm tree is a symbol of water. We identify an oasis by palm trees grow elsewhere, but that is a hallmark of a desert oasis. The willow grows by rivers. It needs a great deal of water to grow. So we take those things that represent a need for water, and then I didn't mention, I mean, I shook it, and the reason that I did that is during the recitation of Psalm 118 at places where we say, please give us salvation, please provide us with abundance, prosperity. There are two different lines of repetitions of these phrases. During that time, we shake the lulav and etrog together we shake it forward in every direction, and forward, to the side, behind us, to the left, above, and below. And so a really visceral kind of, basic needs understanding is that this is where we want to sort of spread the rain-making blessings or prayers everywhere. But I think it moves from there into, obviously pointing in every direction is gesturing towards where God is, right? Everywhere around us. And I talk about it not just in our religious school, also with the adults. I also like to think of it as kind of a magic wand for spreading blessing. That we can think of this as we offer our prayers. It kind of it guides our intention to spread prayer and blessing in every direction. It's one thing to say it, but when you have, the power of an object like this, is it really, again, it's experiential. So let me, I know I've been going on for a bit. Let me just conclude talking about this and then pause again. So I said it kind of starts from this basic needs, prayer for rain, prayer for what we need, but the rabbis attach all sorts of, so over the thousands of years of interpretation, or even just the first few hundred years from the redaction of the Torah into the beginning of the Common Era, Jesus, the antiquity, the first few hundred years of the Common Era. There are all sorts of interpretations of what these items mean. So one is that we bring them all together, and they read each one as, one has a fragrance and it can be eaten. One has a fragrance where it can't be eaten. One doesn't have a fragrance and can't be eaten. They each have different qualities, and these are likened to individuals. Some have a good intentions, but not good acts. Some have good acts, but their heart is not in the right place. Some have neither. And the idea is they're all brought together, and we imagine this as representative as Jews of our people, that we stand in unity, that our community encompasses everyone, and even those who are not the most laudable, that we all have a place and we're all connected in a congregation, sort of in the broadest sense. We also look at this as there's an interpretation that this represents what we need what is needed to be a good person. The willow, as you hopefully can see, has I'll just pull one off actually. And this is very wilted. When we would be using it, it would be much fresher, just so you know. Right, but you can see the shape, hopefully. They look like lips, right? So in order to do good, we need to be able to speak kindly. We need to be mindful of what we say. We also need our lips, our mouth to communicate, to learn from others what to do or to teach what is right. The myrtle, right? You can see. Looks like an eye and is shaped like an eye. So we need our eyes to observe, to see where there is need, to observe, to see what to do, what not to do by being attentive to what is going on around us. The palm, we even talk about it as having a part of the diagramming of a palm frond is its spine, but it reminds us of or represents a spine with I think, a double meaning of to have the courage of convictions, right? To have a backbone to do what is right or what is needed, but also very physically and literally to move and to act in the world. We need a spine, and then the citron is either you can see these bumps reminiscent of a brain or a heart, either of which are needed to drive all of these sensory elements to think, to know, to decide what to do, or to feel, to be guided by our compassion towards kindness, towards sympathy, empathy for others. So that adds another level, as I talked about, this sort of magic wand of blessing, right? It's not just idle, that we're directing it in these ways, but we're taking this sort of talisman, which in totality represents a human being's capacity to do good. And by shaking it in every direction, it's not just this, we're sending our good wishes out, but that it's, representative of an intention to actually physically go out and do that and spread blessing in that regard. So I want to stop there. I know there were quite a number of questions, which I do plan to address, but I want to pause and see if there are any questions here. Yes, Renee, I see your hand.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this correctly. A lulav?
Yes.
Is that
Great,
something
excellent.
that each home would keep in their home?
Yes, a lulav is again, this is something in a more liberal congregation like my own. People don't have individual lulav. I've got a couple for the synagogue that we use collectively, but it is also another thing typically people would own.
Thank you.
And what they would do is they would bring it to the synagogue for during the prayer service. This special during prayer, there's a special service for the festivals that's really a collection of psalms, and they would recite it during that time. And if you go online, you can see we didn't mention from the outset, I'm actually a New Yorker. I'm pretty new to this neck of the woods, but the neighborhood I lived in, which was was a very Jewish neighborhood on the holidays. Many traditional Jews, you would see them walking around with this in a thick with a lulav in a heavy plastic protective kind of not container, but bag, or I'm trying to think of that
Reminds me
flexible,
of like we put like an umbrella inside or something.
yeah. And the etrog, the citron usually gets put into. They have these beautiful like wooden lacquered boxes or things like that to hold them. I'll note that there is a principle within Judaism called in Hebrew hidur mitzvah. It's the beautification of doing right. A mitzvah is a commandment. It's come to mean colloquially also a good deed, but things that we're commanded to do, we could do them in the most basic, simple way, but there's an there's a value for elevating the ritual, beautifying the ritual objects, which maybe obviously or not, but I'll take your mind there, right? This could be problematic. Also, we don't want to be overly showy, we do, but that can also come to be too much. We don't want this to be about a show of wealth, but really about our love and dedication for these religious acts that we do. So actually, here's a good example of when I realized as we I might as well take the opportunity while we're in this space. This work of art is my wife and my Jewish marriage contract, actually not license, called the ketubah, and it has written. Ours is actually, the traditional ketubah is mainly Aramaic with some Hebrew, but there's a value for creating it as a beautiful work of art. Right, there's a quote from the book of Psalm of Psalms in Hebrew, Song of Songs on the bottom. So there's and depending on how, well, even not so traditional Jews, even liberal Jews are now doing marriage contracts that are English and more egalitarian. This is a sort of traditional one now. Anyway, I won't get into, but it's quite common for people who are having for folks who are having a Jewish wedding to look for such an item, whether it's written traditionally or more modern and reflective of their values and in English, but to be a beautiful work of art. So there's another example. And you will find these and it's not uncommon to find in a Jewish home.
Before we jump to the questions that folks sent in, just for a point of reference, if people want to go back and check it later, the Gospel of John, chapter 7, Jesus travels to Jerusalem for the festival of Sukkot. And there's, at the beginning of the chapter, he's deciding, should I go or not? I've kicked up a lot of controversy. Maybe it's not smart for me to go, but he does end up going. And of course, he ends up teaching in the temple. And some people say, this is great. And other people say, this guy's got to go. So the traditional answer, how long was Jesus active and doing his ministry? The traditional answer, of course, is 3 years, which is based on the Gospel of John. If you look at the kind of number of ritual or the number of pilgrimage festivals that it talks about Jesus deciding whether to go or not, it adds up to being a span of 3 years. Now, as we touched on, Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't do that. In theory, Jesus' ministry could have been a year. He started right after Passover 1 year, and then it ended at Passover the following year. So just just for point of reference there with something folks may be a little more familiar with. I just wanted to toss that, toss that out there for you.
So I realize, and let me give the opportunity to say, I realize I'm kind of working this morning. The timing was a little thrown, but I also, I paused at the hour mark. Well, on Zoom, you can always log off, I guess. Not I guess, I mean, I know that you can. But I will acknowledge that there are these questions, and if you have somewhere to be or to go, it's understandable. This morning, as we hit that mark, we're able to, in the same space, say, should we go on or what have you. So I want to.
Right. And we're usually here till about 8:30 in the evening, so folks should be probably planning on being here for a little while yet. So.
Oh, okay, great. So. Right, this morning I was detained, so, okay. So, I will start, I'll start with addressing the questions that I received that were really, really wonderful questions and thought-provoking. I'll do my best to be equal to them. In the last 50 years, church attendance across nearly all Christian denominations has declined. Has a similar decline occurred with synagogues? Any thoughts on why? So yes, that's a trend that we see from Pew across the board, that there is less religious affiliation. So I would say, so there are some common reasons that apply across the board about relationship to organized religion and a decrease in affiliation, which of course is just really answering a question with what is probably another symptom or an explanation that isn't really an explanation. Okay, so why less affiliation? I think that one thing I'll say uniquely Jewish is, and this is an opportunity to just address sort of the caricature of Judaism, which is that it is not, I quote a professor of mine from rabbinical school who talked about the sociology of religion in America, and Judaism gets defined as a religion, but really, or identified as a religion, but defined really from a Christian lens in a lot of ways, right? We talk about the Jewish faith, but within Judaism, I would say, I mean, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi would disagree with me on this, but there's not as strong a focus on faith, right? Believing how you believe or believing the right way is less significant within Judaism. There's much more focus on action. I mean, as a religion that's at its core, there's a legal element that legislates how we behave, and I don't mean how we treat each other, but literally what we do at which times, what we eat, what we wear. So it's much more focused on that, on practice. But I mention this because it's also more than that, right? There's an element of nationality, of ethnicity, of culture, so this is kind of a roundabout way back to the question. Part of the answer to a decrease in affiliation is that as Jews arrived in America, there was a very strong, I'll call it tribal component, a strong ethnic, hereditary, familial element to being Jewish. People affiliated because it's what you did, it's what was the right thing to do as to show your Jewish identity. So as there's been more intermarriage, and people don't share the same cultural associations, right? People don't have the Eastern European sounding Yiddish accented grandparents that many Jews mid-century certainly had. It just so happens I'm a bit of a vestige. I had grandparents like that, but I'm young for that. Most people my generation did not have those sort of Yiddish speaking grandparents. So when you don't have that common association, the need to affiliate is not as strong. And it was, I think, a failure of many congregations to recognize that and make the much needed shift that has happened in the last decade or two towards Jewish education that is more meaning oriented and more relevant, and creating reading Judaism as a resource for finding meaning in the world. So that's another answer, I think, that crosses that last piece I just described about Judaism. My hunch, and Pastor, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that many of our religious institutions, I mean, as more small c conservative, right, less oriented towards change, sort of took for granted that people want to affiliate. They know that what we have is the gateway towards teaching them the right way to practice, without worrying about, but are we, if people don't come at it with that assumption, is there a value proposition? Are we giving people, helping them find meaning in the world? And especially, and this is very resonant in this also, I will say, is very, I know applies in Christianity and gives you a sense of the Jewish community. Again, in the liberal Jewish communities, less observant, there is also a lot of agnosticism, questioning, or outright lack of belief in God. And if your central teaching or the way you pray and talk is very God-centered, for and this is sociologically true. The Jewish community, at least historically, was the rates of bachelor's degree, graduate degrees, etc. A very highly educated community. If you're going to be, educated in a rational, kind of questioning way, and then you're not bringing kind of a parallel level of sophistication, you're going to lose people. And I think that also, I'm not saying that's unique to Jews. I'm talking about the Jewish community, and I think it is common as we have as our secular education goes. And I'll say a last thing that really struck me with the pastor's opening is that I think many of these institutions do not provide a space for being our authentic selves. That there's this focus towards, all is wonderful, God will lift us up, and we'll find joy and inspiration, and, things are wonderful if you can just look at it and have faith. And I think, I really, Pastor, I don't know, I saw in what you were doing, or part of what I took away is giving people the space to say there are some crummy things in our lives, and that also can bring us to a house of worship, a time of need, not just celebration. So
Yeah, let me very briefly jump in, and Rabbi, what you said about sometimes as people are becoming more educated, the level of sophistication that people have with how they understand who God is, what God does, how God works. Um, for a lot of people, in a church, it kind of stops with confirmation. And whether that is, seventh, eighth grade, even if it's high school, a lot of times that is the last time people really concentrate hard on studying what do I believe about God and so on. So of course, if I only have a high school education and suddenly I'm confronted with, hey, here's some sort of high-end chemistry stuff that we need you to solve, I'm not going to be up to the challenge. And I think to an extent that's also true in our faith. If we stop growing at a certain point, we suddenly find the faith we had as a 12 or 13-year-old is most likely not up to the challenges we face as adults. I don't remember who said it, but someone coined the term moralistic therapeutic deism to describe a lot of what passes for Christianity. God is moral, like there's a sense of right and wrong. God is therapeutic. God exists to help me feel good. And it's deism. God is kind of spongy. There's not a lot we can definitely say. So if suddenly I don't feel good and God doesn't make me feel good, God doesn't fix this thing that's wrong, if that's what my belief in God is rooted in, that belief is going to have major problems. So I think that is definitely one of the strands that we see happening. I think people, and I guess I would have to say that as a clergy person, some of that may fall on our people, and I'll stop there. My people can hear
Absolutely.
me rant and rave about this.
No, I thank you so much
I want to make
for.
sure you've got time and space here.
No, thank you so much for adding that, because it's the more different we think we are, the more same we actually find out we indeed the more sameness there is underneath. And we talk about, you reminded me of another huge issue that was near and dear to my heart, as having been an education director and running a religious school for many years, and shifting towards more of a family education model, recognizing that what we were running up against was less, we were doing the right thing in our education was progressive and constructivist and really engaging kids and prompting them to question. And the issue was actually their parents, who still had this, fossilized, bug frozen in amber kind of Judaism from their, probably for some of them traumatizing, even, Hebrew school experiences, that was ridiculous and nonsensical. And even worse, I mean, you can imagine the challenges you face with religious education. Now throw on top of that, you're trying to get kids, some of whom may have had learning issues, undiagnosed, when they were, who are now adults, trying to learn an entire different alphabet and read in that. And for what reason? Because that's what we pray in. I mean, again, how's that a good way to justify? I mean, there is a way to justify it. Hebrew is a beautiful language that I love, but we don't, we're not giving them that ability. So very similar challenges. Thank you. So, I'll just go in order. In chapter 23 of our New Testament Gospel of Matthew, Jesus delivers a scathing rebuke against the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. Curious if you're familiar with this text and your thoughts. So, I did quickly go over it earlier this morning. There was a question: am I familiar with any of the New Testament or Christian Bible Gospels? And I said that I had read some. I'm most familiar actually with Matthew. As a graduate student, I taught that. I taught pieces of the text of Matthew in a course on ancient Judaism. And I'll share before just getting to your question, my observation. What I always found about Matthew is that the voice of the various figures, including Jesus, to me reminds me of, if people are familiar with like Jackie Mason or Billy Crystal or maybe even Jerry Seinfeld, like a very Jewish kind of, I'm naming comedians, but heavily very Jewish accented English. It sort of reminds the way of approaching scripture and each other, and the way of communicating and in parables and argumentation. It reminded me of the rabbinic literature of the same period that I was very familiar with, and in that regard, it was a surprise to me. I like to say it's almost like suddenly finding Jackie Mason, a very Jewish sounding kind of figure in the Gospels, and so I did review chapter 23, and what I would say is, so I don't have, I'll give some observations that are shared. I shared this morning is that, and here again, recognizing recognizing the gap between and being attentive to that, and trying. Please know. Or note if I'm coming off as disrespectful, but communicating my perspective on the text in a more historical and in a academic framework, and to some extent from a Jewish place, right? So not seeing Jesus as a figure in a different way. What comes out very strongly in those early Gospels, I know Matthew's one of the earlier ones, is Jesus as a reformer. I happen to the denomination of Judaism I'm in, one of the more liberal denominations, is the Reform movement. People who in the 18th and 19th century Germany, Jews were trying to reform Judaism, make it more compatible with the modern world around them, and with their values and their beliefs. And so Jesus is, I see as a reformer, railing against the same thing that the prophets do, actually, by the way. The problem with Judaism as a legalistic religion is there's so many polarities within Judaism and tensions that go on, that continue throughout Jewish history. One of them is, right versus right, R-I-T-E versus R-I-G-H-T, right? In other words, that's the snappy way of saying it. The ritual versus the values, righteousness. Not that they are opposed, but those are two poles, and we want to live right in the balance, in the middle, where our righteousness aligns and is guided by the ritual, and the ritual serves to amplify our doing good in the world, right? We think of our lulav and etrog, where the meaning behind it is to get us to be good people. And so I was thinking of not necessarily. So actually, we see this in chapter 23. I don't know this for sure. This is just kind of a brief. I didn't get to do the background research, but as I was looking at it, and Jesus is talking about the different things that they are willing to make oaths on, right. Whoever swears by the sanctuary is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the sanctuary is bound by the oath. Again, there's a section of Jewish law I could look at, but more closely to verify this. So, just know that you're getting a little bit of armchair. I haven't done the necessary background research. The former academic in me always has to make that caveat, but there is particular language about oaths in the ancient world were what bound people. I mean, they were seen as having real weight and power. People were not considered to go against those. I mean, that was all the way up through the medieval times. So there was specific language around oaths, and I could actually imagine where swearing by the sanctuary, it's just a place. Swearing by your gold meant you actually were making an oath that if you violated, you had to back that up with your money, right? To say, oh, I swear by the sanctuary, that's meaningless. But if I say, if I violate this oath, I swear by the gold that I will bring to the sanctuary, in other words, for a sacrifice, then that has meaning, right? So that's potentially some of the backdrop. But Jesus is rightly pointing out, you guys are getting so involved in this. He's schooling them. There's a lot of language play, which is also very characteristic of that, what the rabbis did, reading scripture very, very closely, and then the law closely and everything else, where he's turning it on its head and pointing out the irony. Yeah, you may be doing the right thing. Maybe swearing by the sanctuary is kind of not saying much, but when your values are so out of whack, I'm going to call you out on it. So even if there may be a legal explanation for what they're doing, he's teaching an incredible, it's an incredibly elegant homiletic message to take the ritual and turn it on its head in that way. And so, there is, he's railing against, the ways in which this happened. And the Pharisees were, sadly, in our history, they are actually a more egalitarian, democratic presence, but they are also elite, as versus the Sadducees, who are descended from the priests, who are the real aristocracy, right? Pharisees probably may have come from money, but ultimately their value, they were like, I hate to say it, Pastor, they were the clergy, they were the teachers, they were learned, but that may have often meant also that they had the money to be learned in the ancient world. But still, a merit that was earned through, knowledge, wisdom, teaching, as opposed to Sadducees who were, descended from priests.
And the thing I'll throw out there just briefly is, so folks who studied Matthew's Gospel with me will recall that Matthew's Gospel does not depict the Pharisees in a neutral way. We're at a point where we're trying to say, who are the rightful heirs to all of God's promises? Is it the people following the Pharisees, or is it the people following Jesus? And Matthew very clearly wants you to come to a specific conclusion to that. So his depiction of the Pharisees is not just a neutral historical, this is the sort of thing they did. He was trying to make a point as well.
Well, often we save our greatest animosity for those who are most similar or closely aligned to us, because it drives us nuts that, how do you not see it? We're so aligned in so many other ways. It's easier to have a friendly depiction of the Romans. I mean, they're just benighted. Well, actually, ultimately, they're the people who they want to convert. So, I mean, all the more reason to, down the line, to say, they just haven't, they're not educated in the right way. If we can show them the light, then, anyway. So, I'm sorry, I'm taking, again, see our time, and there's a bunch more questions. I'll move as quickly as I can, and again say, if you need to go, I understand. And these are not, some of these are pretty potentially complex, like the next one, although I'll try and answer it in a somewhat straightforward way. There's a fairly small but vocal group in the U.S. Congress who have taken a decidedly anti-Israeli posture with respect to the Palestinian situation. Do you have any response concerning this? Yes, it's Israel is heartbreaking for me as someone who, most of my extended family lives there. I've lived there. I grew up in a Zionist youth group, but also grew up in my younger days with a more, what we would call now, a more traditionally right-wing narrative and understanding of the history. And as I grew up, really, and became more educated, understanding a far more nuanced understanding of this situation. And so one of the so there is reason to be, I mean, there's reason to be anti-Israel. There is, as I said, it's heartbreaking that the Israelis occupied this territory with the intention of using it as a bargaining chip for peace, right? And at some point along the line, they got stuck with it. What is infuriating to me and what I criticize is, okay, when I was growing up, and this was even less, 20 years after the occupation, it was not even so new, fine. But now, yes, it's very hard to figure out what to do with it, but to still go back to these arguments, well, we're waiting to use it as a bargain chip, this, the Israelis are just trying to remain in this status quo. They're deadlocked, and it's very difficult, and it's difficult to find partners to come to the table, and there are unquestionably, at times, human rights violations. And saying, getting into the both-siderism, yes, there are terrorist attacks, but the scale of violence, anyway, it's just a mess. And so what is also really difficult that enters into this, and this isn't necessarily applied to some of the people in Congress, but there is an anti-Israel, anti-stance that is anti-Semitism masking as anti-Israel or anti-Zionism, and how you can't see what's in people's heart, but, well, it often can reveal itself based on, what people say or how they act, not always. That's troubling. But I am not, there are other Jews who are, 100% unquestioning, unwavering support of Israel, and that's not where I come from. So I hope that kind of answers that question. Okay. So do Jews believe in a literal interpretation of the Hebrew Bible? This gives me an opportunity to say something I said this morning, which is, I really always like to talk about and teach about not a Judaism, but Judaisms. And this doesn't apply just for Judaism, as I said this morning. I mean, some of this is my orientation to the world and not seeing monolithic structures, right? I was saying this morning, I would say the same thing about America. There isn't an America, there's Americas. There's what America means to different people, different geographical areas, different, ideologies. And which is not to say it's completely fragmented. There are things that hold us together, but it does mean that it's hard to talk monolithically about, what Judaism say. And so as far as this question goes, I would answer it, yes, some Jews believe in a literal interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, generally ultra-Orthodox, but the vast majority, I would say, of Jews who are interacting in, kind of modern life, so that includes Orthodox who keep the law, but not as, don't set themselves apart and live in, totally separate communities, do not read the Hebrew Bible literally. And then it goes all the way to me as a rabbi. I mean, if ask my own beliefs and how I teach it, I will make no bones about the fact that for me, this being a divine work means that it's divinely inspired insofar as it is an expression of individuals or communities trying to express their highest ethical ideals, their highest aspirations, but it is not a work that is given by God in some, in some literal way. So let me segue into what is the Jewish belief in following all the commandments found in the book of Leviticus. So first of all, many of those relate to there needs to be a temple, or they are only observed in the land of Israel, and even then, perhaps only in a pure state, which requires a temple. So I'm not sure which commandments the questioner had in mind, but I'll say that, Leviticus is often trotted out when, and Pastor, I'm sure you'll appreciate this, when people want to set up religion as a straw man and say, well, whoa, you're a religious person. Do you follow this? And they'll pull out. Leviticus is often quoted as some of the more obscure pieces. And, we don't, in our, no, some of those just are historically not relevant anymore. That's not the most representative way to think about scripture, think about the Torah. And I think I addressed what do the Jewish people believe, or many Jewish people believe, about Jesus and his teachings. Again, as I said, I would say, I said reformer. I think that most Jewish people would see Jesus as, I often think of him as rabbi. I mean, rabbi in the sense of teacher, but even potentially, given his level of familiarity, not just with scripture, but with law, someone who probably would have been schooled, and maybe even initially would have been trying to, as I said, reform the practice of the law, pushing back against some of the Pharisees, but in his own way, in a Pharisaic tradition, if that makes sense. That's the people who are most similar to us draw the most animosity. You could even see him as part of a more left-leaning sort of Pharisaic, group pushing back against a dominant, more kind of aristocratic strain. But that's not necessarily either. There were many other kinds of strains of Jews around at that point. So then I'll leave so I left a few for these last ones, some just of these personal questions, which I really appreciate. What are some of your more favorite characters, stories, or books of the Hebrew Bible? What are your favorite Jewish? Well, I'll start with favorite Jewish holidays. So one of, and then end with some of the Bible pieces. But my favorite, probably my two favorite are Passover, which just has a lot. It's a home-based holiday. It's a food-based holiday, to be, stereotypically. I don't know if this stereotype has reached you. We Jews love our food. We're eaters. Right now, we're struggling with COVID. People can't seem to wrap their mind around the fact that you could have a Jewish program without offering food. I mean, that's just constitutionally incapable of imagining this. So there is that the food element, but it's a service, but that's done in the home, and means that each family does it its own way. And in the home that I grew up in, and in my teen years of families that we observed Passover with, there's a lot of music, a lot of singing. It's just joyful, fun, a lot of kidding around. so it's a great holiday. And actually, probably that's kidding around. One of the other holidays I really love that comes just before holiday is the holiday Purim. The story is told in the book of Esther, but as I like to say, it's serious fun, right? The book of Esther is comedy and absurd, but also teaches deep truths through comedy, which I think is so wonderful and powerful. There's definitely a strong Jewish tradition around that, Jewish humor of telling truth wrapped in humor. And Esther is one of the origins of that. And if you're familiar with the book, or I recommend reading it, but read it not, well, I'll say something about the humor in a moment, but the king, who is the most powerful, is completely at the mercy of his Jewish princess, who kind of wraps him around his finger. The evil villain who wants to kill all the Jews builds a gallows so that he can hang them all. How does he meet his end? On the gallows that he built for the Jews to be killed. And the deep truth is how everything is upside down. Identities are slippery. The people who appear the most powerful are often the weakest, and vice versa, or both. And there's just wonderful. It's a really psychological work in that way. And I'll just recommend, the pastor mentioned this morning something about humor came up, and I'm not familiar enough with Christian Bible to say this, but I can say with authority about the Hebrew Bible that we often make the mistake of reading it too straight. That there are unquestionably sections in my mind that are meant to be humor that we miss, and maybe even that's part of the alienation that we were talking about earlier, because we read them straight. We read them so straight we want to even sometimes read them as truth, as a true story that happened, as opposed to a legend or a parable that's humorous. And I actually that's maybe a good segue into people ask my favorite characters, stories, books. One great example of that is the story of Balaam, the prophet who is hired by Balak. And I'm getting this confused even intentionally, where it's not coincidental. I'm pretty sure it's Balaam, hired to curse the Israelites. And if you don't know the story, I can actually easily find the reference. And on his way, he asked God, and God, so he's not Jewish, but he has a dialogue with God. And God says, don't go. And then they offer him a ton more money, and he's sort of like, please, God. And God says, okay, go. But then on his way to curse the Israelites, an angel appears on his way, and his donkey, who is taking him, sees the angel and tries to stop him. And he starts beating his donkey mercilessly. Why aren't you going? So here is this prophet who can't see the angel in front of him, but his donkey can. So you tell me that's not meant to be irony and humorous, until finally his donkey turns to him and he's like, why are you beating me? He literally starts talking to him. So even the fact of the hero, the king is the Moabite king, I believe, is Balak, and the prophet is Balaam. But even those two names are Tweedledee and Tweedledum. I mean, they're intentionally, confusing and similar. So that's a story that I love, and there's so much in there. I'll say two other stories. They're generally actually going to be from the Torah, because that's really what the 5 books of Moses is, what I spend my most time with. Every week we read a different section, and that's really what I generally will preach on, the weekly portion. One of them is the story of Jacob wrestling with an angel, or with the shadow figure, I'll say, as Jacob's on his way to reunite with his brother Esau, who he tricked out of the firstborn blessing. Just such a deeply, again, psychological, insightful story. Here's Jacob, the trickster, trying to come back and meet his brother as something else, show his growth and his maturity. And in the middle of the night, he wrestles with a figure. Who is that figure? I traditionally will say God or an angel, but, Jacob's wrestling with himself. Jacob is trying to, there are many, each reading, it's just such a rich story with so many different dimensions and levels to it, who is this figure? And then in the end, he is renamed, and that gives our people our name, which also I just love. He is renamed as Israel, one who struggles with beings both divine and human. And as Jews, we find it's all about the wrestling. It's less about the answer and the certainty, and more about the questioning and the striving to grow and get greater clarity and get closer to something, to clarity, to truth. But I think truth is seen as in the divine realm, something that is beyond our ken. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention also, just because it's a touchstone story for me, it was my bar mitzvah portion, and then when I was in rabbinical school, randomly this was assigned to me for my senior sermon. That's something that we had to deliver, and it's the story of the immolation of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu. An incredibly moving and powerful story of brothers, of grief, of how we comfort, how we can be with or not be with someone in a moment of need. And there's incredible pastoral lessons to take away from it. And it's just a beautiful story. The first story itself is, I think, 4 or 5 verses, but another time in my teaching of it or sermonizing on it, read the more expanded story, and there's more, but even just in the elegance of the Bible and its terseness and what it can get across in 3, 4, 5 verses is just breathtaking. Would you read for us in Hebrew a favorite Bible verse? So there were a couple I thought of. One, and a few of them are actually kind of fragments of verses from the Song of the Sea that the Israelites sang after crossing over the dry Sea of Reeds. It's beautiful poetry, and there is a song. There is a fragment that is that we sing as a song as well. The English, it's verse 15. It's chapter 15, verse 2 of the book of Exodus. Adonai is my strength and my might. He has become my deliverance. What I love about it is the English, again, translation is interpretation, or you have to make a decision. But my strength, and the word for might is a synonym with song. my song. So as someone who loves music and finds tremendous spiritual expression through music, I love a rendering of this where my strength is through song, or my strength is a kind of song, that God is my song. I mean, there's very many ways to render this, and that is Ozi v'zimrat Yah vayehili lishua. And the continues Ze Eli ve'anvehu Elohei avi ve'aromemenhu. And actually, you get some of the poetry of some of the Hebrew doesn't generally do rhyming, but it does do repeated sounds. Actually, I've done teaching about Song of the Sea, and what it does do is for a prayer that captures some of it is the drowning. There's a lot of exhalation. There's a lot of ah or who or so you get some of that. Right? Ze Eli ve'anvehu Elohei avi ve'aromemenhu. Anyway, so that's one, and another one that I love. I've been using a lot as a prayer. We have a prayer for healing. That's for those who are sick and might recover. But we also do a prayer. We've started doing a prayer for long-term. It's a different kind of healing for long-term challenges, right? Chronic illness, physical, emotional, spiritual. There are things that many of us carry that will not be resolved, and so that prayer is more about strength or inspiration or hope. So one of the songs that I've done is from Psalm 118, and I'm not sure the verse because now I'm doing it out of our prayer book. But I should find that just so you know. So I can read the translation first. I'll just quickly, again, thank you for listening and patience. I know we're long here, but so it's verse 118, verse 5. In distress, I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and brought me relief. And the Hebrew is min hametzar karati yah anani bamerchavya. So again, a more literal translation might be min hametzar is from the narrow place, from a place penned in and confined and constricted and uncertain. Karati Yah, I called out. Yah is one less common name of God in Hebrew, but you could also, it works poetically as just when I'm in desperation, I call a Yah. It's just a call in that way of just Anani Bamerchav Yah. And I was answered from a wide open place, again, by God. But on a human level, and looking at this as the way in which we channel the divine and can help each other, right? When I'm in that narrow, confined place, I seek out someone to answer me, right, with an echoing, just as I call out, Yah, someone answered back, they echo my call, as if to say, I hear you, I see you, I know what you are saying. You said Yah, I say Yah. That person answers me. You're in the confined place, they're in a wide open, they're in a place with more comfort, with a little more strength, and can reach out and answer. So a little teaching, I guess the rabbi in me can't help that. I know you just asked me to read, but hope that was okay.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for your time and your insight. Thank you for your willingness to join us electronically and share so much from your knowledge. Um, and hopefully we will, you and I will get together and we'll have the chance to do this again.
Yes, absolutely.
I
Thank
have a
you.
real quick
Thanks.
question, Rabbi.
Yeah,
Can
sure.
can a person, my husband and I talk about this all the time, that it'd be neat if our church took like field trips to like go to a service at a different church. Now I've been to the synagogue and enjoyed going just to learn about things, but can a person just go and be at one of your services to experience it, or is it taboo?
I think that's okay. My hesitation, besides obvious COVID regulations and following whatever practices, are just yeah. I think in our congregation they would say that's wonderful. I have a little bit more of a security mindset in just knowing who's coming in, and probably again practically might want to know. I'm affiliated with Pastor Eric's congregation, and I was interested in so it's not because sadly this is a somewhat difficult neck of the woods to be in, from what I know of congregants and some of the anti-Semitism that sadly they have faced. So I would just say, ask that
Right.
from a practical perspective. But we would love to have you, and
Cool,
and I'm
thanks.
sure there's interest and curiosity on our end as well.
Cool.
So thanks everyone. Again, if you have any, I know we've gone long, so if you do have a question or two we want to ask, but it's also late and I still have a eulogy to finish. So
Yes, it should certainly let
no,
you
I'm
tend to that. But
no,
again,
but
thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your willingness to be here, and thank you everybody who has joined us tonight. So blessings on your Thursday. No, it's still Wednesday. Blessings on your Wednesday, and we will see everyone again soon.
all right, great. Thank you
Thank you,
so much,
Rabbi.
everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Pastor.
Bye.
Thank you, Pastor. Good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
Pastor. Yes,
Good
thanks.
night.
Good night.